This is the first video in a series of videos in which my goal is to dig deep into the current state of AI agents and AI coding editors, and I want to basically just figure out how to get the most out of these current tools. And I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's kind of been sitting back, just kind of watching this stuff unfold and trying to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of it, but also not really double down on it and spend my time learning how to use this stuff. And so even though I have been using Cursor, I really have been laying off from using the agents too much, basically because in my experience they kind of like mess up your code base and and like kind of create more work for you than it's worth. But I think that now is actually the time to figure out how to make the most out of it, because it seems like it's kind of stabilizing, and people who I actually respect are kind of changing their mind after they see things. They're finding out how productive people actually can be with this stuff. And so I think now is definitely the time to look into it. And so that's what I'm going to be doing in this series of videos. And basically what I want to do in this first video is just going to be some slides. I'm just going to talk about what's going on currently. And then the goal is to build an app. But I really don't care so much about the app. It's just a silly idea. But what I really want to do is kind of like hone the tool set, figure out like what rules actually matter, what MCP servers actually matter. Cursor now is this idea of hooks. So you can like hook into the prompts and the responses, so you can run like locally your own tool chain basically to modify the context. And people are talking about context engineering. That's like the next big thing, where people are figuring out that like really instead of just caring about the prompt, you need to really control what's in the context that's going to the LLM, which obviously makes sense. But like that's basically the difference between having something that is actually going to help you with your work and something that's just going to be kind of a gimmick. So like I said, I think it's pretty obvious that these AI tools have been in a hype cycle, and that it's kind of flattening out now, which means that, or it's kind of dropping now, which means it might be time to kind of jump in, because even though the hype cycle is kind of dropping, like the actual tools are actually improving. And so it's probably good to get in like down here, you know. If you want to buy low and sell high, I feel like now is probably a good time. And so, yeah, early adopters get burned. This is something I've seen with a bunch of people just with these AI coding tools over the last like 2 years. Like people have like completely kind of jumped in on these custom MCP servers and different tools. One guy was working on like a browser MCP server so that the different LLMs could see like, basically see your Chrome DevTools output and things like that, and the different HTTP responses and errors, and even like Chrome, I think it's called Lighthouse, like your performance scores on these different metrics and things like that. And like all that stuff's kind of just been washed away now because Cursor's now implemented it like natively within their own app. So like any time spent on either learning, either developing it or even just using it yourself, like, reading through the documentation and getting it set up, like all that would have been a waste of time. So I'm kind of glad that I didn't jump in yet on that. And similarly, another guy, he realized pretty early on that like these agents really would benefit from like a planning stage and like to-do lists, and he was building like an app all around that, basically kind of like a wrapper for Claude, I think. I don't exactly know what it was, but like planning was a key aspect of it. And then the Claude people ended up like implementing that themselves, and then now Cursor has like a planning agent. And so like even though he was right about this, that this would be like a really beneficial thing, like it was just like a big waste of time from his point of view. And so like, yeah, early adopters in general is just probably not the best thing. But I do think that it's kind of stabilizing now. I think this Cursor 2.0 is kind of an indication of that they're at least kind of committed to like this new paradigm. You see which direction the company's going in. They're working on like these agents where you can run them in parallel or something like that. So like it seems like the actual control of the context with like rules, and there's now something called like hooks, so you can like hook in to these different times, these different events, like before the prompt gets sent to the LLM and when it gets sent back and things like that. So you can then do your own stuff locally. I feel like now that stuff's all kind of becoming not just like out there officially as part of the API, but other people are looking at it, it means like now's probably a good time to jump in, because that stuff's probably not really going to change, because there's just not much that can change about it. And so, yeah, it's definitely stabilizing enough that I think now would be a good time to jump in. And this is maybe a bit of a random thought, but I've been thinking a lot about how these AI coding tools now are probably a bit like chess engines were in the 1980s. And so in the 1980s, like the chess engines, they still couldn't beat the best players in the world, but they were better than the best players in the world at basically looking at what options were available like a couple moves deep. So they weren't capable of like really deep thinking. They couldn't see like 20 moves ahead the way that like grandmasters could with their like deep like positional knowledge of the game. But they were much better at the more shallow, just a couple moves deep type of thing. And so I feel like that's kind of like what AI coding tools are like now. Like they're really good at like these like simple tasks, but they really can't see the big picture. You know, they can't like do basic like system design type problems. Like they're not really good at coordinating between lots of different components, different files, front end, back end, things like that, let alone like race conditions and things like that that really require higher level reasoning. But they're definitely really good at the smaller tasks. And so an interesting thing though is that like an average player using a chess engine as like a guiding tool would have been able to beat the best grandmasters in the 1980s. And I feel like similarly, like if you use like these tools like the way that like you know if you just use it as something on top of what you're already doing, it's going to give you like a huge advantage. But it's still not quite at the place yet where you just want to like set and forget an agent and have it solve some really high level problem. Like it's not really going to be able to do that. But if you set it off to like solve a bunch of smaller tasks that you're coordinating, then you're going to get like a huge boost in productivity. All right, so let's talk about what the AI agents are good at and not that good at. And so they're really good at boilerplate code and scaffolding. They'll like set up a whole like test suite for you where it used to be a complete hassle to set up and had all sorts of different conflicting issues with your current setup. And you know, there's like integration testing. I'm thinking from web dev's point of view, the different types of tests and different packages and all that stuff. And it's basically a solved problem now. Although I think that's also in part because the tools have just gotten better also. They're not quite as bad as they used to be. Boilerplate code. They're also great at like anything that like exists in the documentation basically. So like one thing I did somewhat recently is I used something called React Table, which is probably the most common or the most popular of the React Table libraries. And in the documentation, there's like multiple different examples for doing different types of things. And I basically asked it to like merge a bunch of the different examples together because I needed different aspects of the different examples, and it did it fairly well. And so that was actually pretty impressive. And so it's really good at that type of thing. Anything that like has a pre-existing example, it's going to be great at. And it's also great for like finding config options and API functions, things that like when you're trying to solve a problem and like you don't know if you're going to have to implement it yourself or if the library might have some way of kind of hooking into like the exact place you need, finding some like event callback to modify some value. It's really good at that type of thing too. Basically just saving you from having to skim through the documentation. And that's actually a huge like productivity improvement already. Like I remember with like Webpack, if you wanted to like do some type of pre-processing like on your CSS or something, like somewhere along the pipeline, like you were going to have to like learn a whole architecture. Like it was insane. And so already we're doing a lot better. And it's also really good at like small functions. It's good at like here I have like regular expressions and like date time, like messing with like, you know, the date APIs and basically anything where like you used to be able to find a Stack Overflow snippet of code that did something. Like basically all that stuff's been absorbed by the language models, and it just knows how to do it. Let's see what it's not that good at. So this is kind of like a class of problems that I think of them as like problems where you'd like have to like turn off the music you were listening to and like think hard about. You know, the type of problems where you'd have to kind of walk around and like actually think about it instead of just like, it's not just like copying another file and like changing some names, adding one more thing that already exists somewhere else. And so these types of problems, like the LLMs and agents, they can solve them, but you really have to provide a good context. And so being productive with the AI agents and coding tools, it's really all about controlling the context. And people have been calling that context engineering. It's really just in cursor, it's like including the correct rules and like examples and the files that are relevant. And within the prompts, basically telling it like exactly what to do. And this type of thing, it's like, I feel like you're going to have less luck with the agent if you just kind of give it a high level explanation of, like say you want to solve this problem, but it sometimes can do really good now with the planning stage. So if you tell it to like start with a plan and like implement it step by step, the agents are actually pretty good at that. And the problem then really is just making sure that like you'd never sign off on a bad plan, basically. But one thing with this type of this tier of challenge is that maintainable code is kind of an issue, because as it's like it sort of doesn't understand like any of the implications of the code that it's writing. So it might actually solve a problem, but it'll like introduce like something that really belongs in another file, or it kind of just doesn't really quite fit. And I feel like this type of thing is the kind of thing that I really want to work on while I'm doing this project, because I think that if I just have like really well-defined rules that tell it exactly what to do, this type of thing, maybe even like forcing it to do some type of like step where it really thinks about refactoring and moving stuff around, maybe this could kind of be washed over so that I wouldn't have to basically fix like because right now my workflow is basically like if I have this type of problem and it's something really difficult, I have to like sit down and like think really hard on how to how to write the prompt and get the right context into it to even make an attempt. And then once I finally get it working, I then kind of refine it further manually, where I kind of move stuff around to where I actually want it to be and make everything so it's actually going to be maintainable. And let's look at the stuff that it really just can't even really pull off that well. And that's basically anything with large code bases and like system design things, anything that kind of involves both a front end and then maybe like a back end with like an event queue, or like, it's processing some type of webhook or something like that. Anything like that, I feel like in my experience, like you're really just not going to be able to just ask it to do it and have it actually pull it off. Like in best case scenario, you'll break it down into steps and then hopefully it'll kind of work out. But like I feel like ideally it should be possible for it to actually understand and to like write tests to like kind of mock out the different interactions across the different boundaries and be able to kind of pull it off. But like it's still just not quite there as far as I can tell. And it's kind of like something I've been thinking about is like any problem that's like hard for like a human, it's like definitely going to be hard for an LLM at this point. Because it's like the LLMs, they're great at like the boilerplate stuff, anything that's like ever been written on Stack Overflow. And then when you have like a specific challenge for yourself, some like new kind of thing, and for the most part, like in software engineering, like the actual hard stuff is kind of working on the new problems, the problems that aren't already solved and packaged in some library or service or whatever. And that kind of stuff, like it's just too hard. Like it's not going to be able to do it. So like one thing, also like multi-file changes, like anything that like, if it's going to change something, that it might even be able to get an implementation working, but it's then not going to be able to understand that it's like breaking code elsewhere, unless you have it set up to run tests and things like that. And even in that case, I think it's probably then going to get confused, because at some point it's going to start packing your context with the files that have been broke because of your own implementation. And then it might just end up going like in a circle, just like wreaking havoc all over your code base. So like there's some things where the agents they're not quite there yet. And also just for fun, like prompts from people who don't know how to code, like there's no chance that it's going to be able to do that. I was thinking about like the block editor in WordPress. And like the way this block editor thing works is it's basically a what you see is what you get editor. And they were working on it, and they basically figured out that they could kind of just lift the what you see is what you get editor all the way up to the top of the page, so that like you're basically implementing, instead of just like the post that like lives in some container in the middle of the page, like the entire page is a what you see is what you get editor basically. And so because it was designed that way, there's like all these different contexts that like are used across like a billion different files and like in a billion different ways, because like sometimes it's from the point of view of being used within a theme, and sometimes it's on a post, and like sometimes it's like some normalized object that like doesn't really live on that page. And so like if you don't understand that overall architecture and you just kind of point at like the editor and you say like add something to this, like it's just, there's no chance it's going to be able to implement that. It's not going to know what context to like modify to like save your data on. It's not going to know any of the implications of changing the whatever it is to accomplish whatever task you ask it to do. It might not even be able to find like the component, because like, you know, these files are, that entire project's just huge. It's like a giant thing that's been worked on for like 10 years. And so, yeah, like there's definitely no chance that that someone who doesn't know how to code is going to be able to use this effectively. All right, so how do we make the most of stuff? Like I said, planning is key. Like now the cursor has a planning agent. It kind of becomes like part of the context by default or something like that. You can actually save like a planning file. Some advice I heard was to try and stay within 40% of the available context window. And that's actually because these LLMs have like really giant context windows. You can really include a lot inside of that. You can include lots of files. But one thing I also know is that what's available at the start and the end of those contexts is actually most important for the performance of the output of the thing. And so really what people have been finding is that you need to control the size of that context window. And so it's not really as easy as just throwing everything that you want into it, and then it has it all available and it solves your problems. Like you're kind of always going to be managing that context. And so like manually you can do that. They added some new command called like summarize in Cursor. And then with your agents, you can like kind of probably implement some type of thing that monitors the size and runs a compression step on either some part of the context or the whole thing or something like that. And yeah, it's really all just about controlling the context. And then also, again, I think I already mentioned it, the hooks are really going to be a big thing. And rules are kind of easy and obvious to use. In Cursor, there's now a way to set a rule so that it's not always included. And so somehow the agent can kind of query a description that you give it, and then it'll only include it when it thinks that there's a good chance that it's going to be relevant. But I'm not exactly sure how it does, or when or how it does that. And so I am a little bit worried that it might be including stuff all the time. That's another thing I need to figure out. I want to be able to debug exactly what's going on with the context so that I can figure things like that out. Because it could be that like even like the description that you put on a rule file, that might end up having like a huge impact on the performance, and there really be no way to even know what exactly is going on. So that's something to definitely keep a track of. Oh yeah, examples. Example code is huge for coding. I mean, it's just, you really kind of need it. And another thing I really want to be able to do is kind of just have like rules for like basic software engineering type principles, but only include them when they're relevant. And I think I'm probably going to have to implement my own thing if I want to pull that off. But that's definitely something that I would love to be able to actually do. Yeah, and so the whole point of this basically is that like the dream is to have an agent where you give it some high level description of what it is that you're trying to solve, and that it then does the planning stage for you, and it has like a good workflow where it doesn't like incorrectly believe that it solved a problem that it didn't actually solve, which is another thing that I found seems to happen a lot. And another thing that I saw just recently is that like the ability to catch bad plans early is going to save you so much time within the agent, because like if it starts implementing something that's just a bad idea, like architecturally, like it's just going to be a disaster. Like nothing it does is going to actually work. And similarly, like bad like library choices, like if there's like multiple options, like it could be that one's going to be better suited for your problem. It could also be that one could include things that you're going to need later on, and that would then make it a better option, even though it doesn't impact the current situation. Although I feel like that'd be kind of hard to have an agent understand those types of decisions. So like, yeah, like these high level decisions are going to be a real challenge. And the TDD workflow, I feel like this is something agents already kind of do on their own. It must be written into like the cursor context manually or something, because sometimes you'll ask it to do something and it'll like write like a little script that outputs like some result of a function or something like that, and it'll iterate to figure it out. But I feel like ideally, because these agents can be so destructive on your code base, just maintaining like a giant set of regression tests is going to be huge if you want to be using these things not just for like one-off things, but for actually developing features at a higher level and kind of just treating them like they're basically your coworkers. And yeah, these are the hooks that I was talking about. These are the specific ones. So like before a prompt goes off, you can then send it to your own local LLM, or you can you can query against your own code base if you think there's like extra files or something that you want to include. And the same thing with before a read file. It might make sense to well, you probably could accomplish like the same thing with just a lot of comments, but like if there's some type of thing involved, I don't know, there might be an opportunity to inject some useful context there. And the same thing with after editing files. Like if you see the diffs coming back, I feel like there's probably an opportunity to catch like bad engineering decisions and just like at least prompt it to like take a look at it and make sure that it's actually doing something that isn't like a bad idea. Like in React, maybe a good example would be like one thing people do a lot is they abuse a hook called useEffect, where there's usually a better way to do it, or a better hook. There's newer APIs and things like that. So maybe you could just kind of monitor that and make sure that it's actually being used correctly. So let's talk about what I'm going to be building. It's going to be a blindfold chess app, and basically that just means it's going to be a chess app where I'm also going to have keyboard controls. So I want to be able to basically move the pieces around without looking at the screen and clicking on stuff. Pretty simple. And I like the idea because I don't know anything about these chess libraries, and so I'm going to be able to see how the cursor editor and AI agents are at basically finding the documentation or looking at the type files for the APIs and figuring out how to do this stuff. And I'm going to try my best to not just look at the documentation, because I want to see if it's actually good enough to be able to figure that kind of thing out, because I feel like that's a pretty big barrier to agents, to be able to actually find some library and make sense of it without a human kind of guiding it along. And so I also like the idea because we can concentrate on like a really small front end app to begin with. So like it'll be really small in scope, and then we can build it out. So like, I mean, ultimately this thing could in theory be built out into like an entire chess application with like different users playing each other. And so there's a lot of room to grow on both the front end and the back end. And another thing is, aside from like the actual like implementation type code, the kind of stuff that I usually think about, I also want to play around with how good the LLMs are for like the design aspect of stuff, which is something that I used to be really good with. I used to do a bunch of CSS, but I haven't really been doing it so much lately. I've been kind of moved to the back end. But I feel like there's a that it might be like a really helpful tool. Like one thing I've already done with this is I used GPT-5. I took a screenshot of just like a random theme. I think I went to like Theme Forest or something. And I sent it to GPT-5 and I asked it to extract like a design system just from that picture. And GPT-5 is actually good enough that it extracted out like all the different elements. They call them design tokens in like the design world. So it says like what a button should look like with like specific like the font size. It was able to determine the font size and like information about like the shadows and like all this stuff that I really wouldn't even have thought of. And when combined with I guess I used Claude Sonnet or whatever it was, along with that design file, and I asked it to just implement like a Next.js app, it actually made something that was like surprisingly good. Like it kind of, I really didn't expect it. I kind of thought that the way I was going to have to make the design was I was going to have to basically find an existing website in like HTML and CSS and then ask it to kind of merge it into the new project. And I thought it would be good at that, but like the fact that it was able to just go from like a screenshot to a design.json file that described it, and then from that into an actual app was actually really surprising. And I think one of the reasons it was so good at that is just because everyone's been using like ShadCN and Tailwind for the last like couple years, so much so that like these LLMs just actually know how to do that stuff. And it's kind of funny because I always thought Tailwind was kind of obnoxious, but I think in terms of like how LLMs work, it just kind of accidentally is like exactly what you want because the description for what the element's going to look like is exactly in line. It doesn't have to reference another file or anything. Like there's no chance for it to mess anything up. So that was kind of surprising. And I guess I'll leave it off there. In the next videos, what I really want to do is just kind of step through the different steps, and I'll be sharing like the rules that I make, and if I start like making little scripts that dig into the hooks to do anything, I'm going to be going over that and the more complicated things like that. And so if you like this, I guess subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Thanks.